At 4 minutes past 1 in the morning on the 15th of August, the city of Granada woke up all at once. Not slowly, not room by room, but in a single shared instant across a metropolitan area of 250,000 people. Furniture slid, roof tiles came loose from a church in the old quarter and shattered on the pavement below. Car windows cracked under falling masonry. Then it stopped, and the silence that followed was worse than the shaking, because everyone lying awake in the dark was asking the same question at the same time. Was that the end of it, or was that only the beginning? 4 days later, they had their answer, and it was not the one anyone in Andalusia wanted. This is a story about a city that has lived on top of a network of faults for 1,000 years, and about what happens when that network stops behaving the way people are used to. It is not a story about a single earthquake. That is the part most of the coverage got wrong. A magnitude 4.8 on its own does not close the Alhambra, empty apartment blocks, and send families driving toward the coast with their children asleep in the back seat. What did all of that? Was not one earthquake. It was hundreds. So let us start with what actually happened, because the sequence matters enormously, and the timeline is the thing that explains the fear. The first movement came on the evening of Friday the 14th, a magnitude 3.7 tremor beneath Las Gabias, a town on the southern edge of the Granada sprawl. Intensity 4 on the macroseismic scale. Enough to rattle windows and set hanging lamps swinging, not enough to damage anything. In a province that records small earthquakes almost continuously, a 3.7 is a talking point, not an emergency. People felt it, mentioned it, and went to bed. 6 hours and 20 minutes later came the one that woke the city. Spain's National Geographic Institute, the IGN, the official authority for locating earthquakes on the Iberian Peninsula, initially put it at magnitude 5.0, with an epicenter just north of Alhendín, roughly 10 kilometers south of Granada City. The depth was shallow, somewhere between 2 and 10 kilometers, depending on which revision. You read, and shallow is the word that does most of the work in this entire story. The United States Geological Survey came in higher at 5.2. The IGN later revised its own figure down to a moment magnitude of 4.8 as the analysis matured. That kind of revision is normal, and it is worth understanding rather than reading as a contradiction. Different agencies use different. A fast estimate published while people are still standing in the street in their pajamas. The final number is a considered one. Neither changes what the ground actually did, and what it did was enough. Andalusia's 112 emergency line took more than 80 calls in the first hours. Emergency services reported cracks opening in walls, cornices coming down, rubble across pavements. Firefighters pulled several people out of damaged buildings. The regional government activated the emergency phase of Andalusia's seismic risk plan. The Alhambra was inspected and reported clear. And then, crucially, the ground did not go quiet. More than 20 aftershocks were logged through that first night. Then more the following night, scattered beneath Oguijares, Armilla, Gojar, Churiana de la Vega, the ring of towns pressed against the southern edge of the city. The pattern did not decay the way a textbook aftershock sequence is supposed to. It persisted. It spread sideways. That is the detail seismologists noticed long before the public did. Then came Tuesday the 18th. At 37 minutes past 10 in the morning, with the shops open, the streets full, and the Alhambra receiving its first tour groups of the day, the ground moved again. Harder this time. Magnitude 4.8 at a depth of around 5 kilometers. Epicenter once more in the Alhendín and Gojar sector immediately south of the city. The IGN's provisional reading was 4.6 on the local scale it uses for Iberian events, refined upward as more data arrived. Maximum. Intensity was assessed between 5 and 6, which, in plain language, is the exact boundary between an earthquake everyone feels and an earthquake that begins breaking things. 16 minutes later, a 3.6 beneath Churiana de la Vega. Roughly 40 minutes after that, a 4.6 back at Alhendín. An hour after that, a 4.1 at Gojar. 3 separate tremors above magnitude 4 inside a single morning, underneath a metropolitan area of 250,000 people, every one of them shallow, every one of them essentially underfoot. That morning cost Granada 3 injuries, one of them a child taken to hospital, and the emergency line more than 500 calls. It closed the Alhambra for the rest of the day, with the Nasrid palaces and the Alcazaba evacuated. And it raised a question that no seismologist in Spain could answer cleanly then or now. Not how big was it. That part is easy. The question is what kind of sequence this is, because that answer decides everything that happens next, and the two possibilities point in very different directions. Here's the distinction everything turns on, and it is worth slowing down for, because Spanish seismologists have used these two words carefully all week, while most of the coverage has used them interchangeably. An aftershock sequence has a shape. One large earthquake breaks a patch of fault, the rupture leaves the surrounding rock unbalanced, and the smaller events that follow are the crust settling back into place. The pattern is predictable in one respect. It fades. The tremors get smaller and further apart, and after days or weeks, the ground goes quiet. There's a dominant main shock, and everything else is its shadow. A seismic swarm has no such shape. It is a cluster of earthquakes in a small area over a short period, without a single obvious main event. Nothing dominates. Nothing clearly leads. The energy comes out in installments rather than in one payment, and the sequence can run for weeks or for months, rising and falling without a reliable trend. It does not fade on schedule, because there is no schedule. Granada has now recorded 2 magnitude 4.8 events 4 days apart. That is not the profile of a main shock followed by aftershocks. That is 2 comparable events, and it is the reason the word swarm started appearing in official language rather than the word aftershock. The numbers behind that shift are extraordinary. By Tuesday, the IGN had logged 348 tremors since the sequence began on the Friday evening. By Wednesday, the count had passed 493. That is roughly 1 recorded earthquake every 15 minutes, day and night, for 5 straight days, beneath a single metropolitan area. The overwhelming majority were far too small to feel. Dozens were not. And here's the part that matters most for anyone trying to read the situation honestly. The president of Spain's official college of geologists described Tuesday's activity as being within the normal range and offered the clearest single sentence anyone has produced about what is happening underground. A fault does not necessarily release all its stored energy at once. In this case, it appears to be releasing it over a longer period, through many successive tremors. That framing cuts both ways, and you should hear both directions before you decide how to feel about. Read one way, it is reassuring. Energy leaving the system in hundreds of small installments is energy that is not available for one large rupture. Every 3.4 beneath Ogajares is a little less strain-locked. Read the other way, it is uncomfortable. A swarm is a sequence without a known ceiling. The fact that the crust has produced 40 tremors does not tell you the 41st will be small. Nobody, including the IGN, can predict the magnitude of the next event, and the Institute has been explicit about that. No method anywhere in seismology can say when, where, and how large. So why here? Why does this one basin in southern Spain shake more than almost anywhere else on the peninsula? The answer starts about 600 kilometers to the south, at the boundary between the African and Eurasian tectonic plates. Those 2 plates are converging on each other in a broadly northwest to southeast direction at somewhere around 5 millimeters a year. That is roughly the speed a fingernail grows. It sounds like nothing. Spread across geological time, it is the force that built the Betic Cordillera, raised the Sierra Nevada, and left southern Spain permanently under strain. But the Granada Basin does something counterintuitive with that pressure. Despite sitting inside a converging plate boundary, the basin itself is pulling apart. It sits on top of a low-angle extensional system, and the dominant structures underneath it are normal faults, produced by crust stretching rather than squeezing. The deformation rate is low, around 1.3 millimeters a year, but the fault network is dense. Studies have identified around 30 faults capable, in principle, of generating earthquakes above magnitude 6. Look at the names on the fault maps, and you start to see why this particular sequence has the attention of Spanish geologists. The Granada Fault, the Padul and Niguelas system, Pinos Puente, Antarfe, Santa Fe, Belicena to Alhendín, Dilar. That last cluster of names is not a coincidence. The epicenters of this week's earthquakes, Alhendín, Gojar, Churiana, Ogajares, Las Gabias, sit along the southern margin of the basin where several of these structures run. Then add the 2 amplifiers. The first is depth. Every significant event in this sequence has been shallow, in the range of 2 to 10 kilometers. A shallow earthquake gives its energy almost no distance to travel before it reaches the surface, and almost no rock in which to weaken. That is why a magnitude 4.8 in Granada shakes a city the way a considerably larger earthquake would if it broke 30 kilometers down. It is also why this sequence has been felt across Malaga province, out to the Costa del Sol, and in parts of Almeria. The second amplifier is the ground itself. The basin is filled with sediment, and soft sediment does to seismic waves roughly what a drumhead does to a tap. Research there has detected spectral amplification factors of up to 6.5 at specific locations. That does not mean every earthquake is 6 times worse across the city. It means the subsoil under certain streets can substantially magnify the shaking that arrives there, which brings us to what happened in Las Gabias. Las Gabias sits on the southwestern edge of the Granada metropolitan area, a commuter town of apartment blocks and new-build estates on flat basin floor, not a fragile medieval quarter, ordinary modern Spain. On Tuesday, after a day of tremors rolling through in sequence, inspectors found cracks in the walls of 6 apartment blocks there, containing 371 homes between them. The Guardia Civil moved people out. Roughly 600 residents went into public shelters, while engineers assessed whether it was safe to return. That is the number that should stay with you from this week, not 4.8. 600 people out of their own beds, in a country not usually associated with earthquake displacement, and the human toll shows up in a shape that is easy to overlook. Health services treated 14 cases after Tuesday's events. Most were not crush injuries or lacerations. They were panic and anxiety attacks. That is what a swarm does differently from a single earthquake. A single earthquake is a shock you recover from. A swarm is a week of never quite relaxing, of flinching at a passing lorry, of lying awake waiting for the next one. Local reporting described families abandoning work to drive to the coast on jammed roads with their children in the car. Others, simply, the Andalusian regional government said plainly that there was no imminent danger and the public had not been at risk. He also said it remained impossible to determine the full extent of the damage. Are true at once, and holding both is the honest position. Granada's mayor asked residents to stay at home and, if another tremor came, to avoid going outside and standing next to buildings. That sounds counterintuitive until you understand where the danger actually is in this kind of earthquake. Nothing in this sequence has been strong enough to bring down a properly built modern structure. What it is strong enough to do is knock loose the things attached to the outside of buildings: cornices, ledges, roof tiles, chimneys, air conditioning units. In one town southeast of the city, residents reported chimneys coming down. The street immediately below a facade during a tremor is the most dangerous place to stand in the city. And the instinct that sends people running outdoors is the instinct that puts them there. Now step back from this week, because history tells you how seriously to take it, and Granada's history is not gentle. On Christmas Day 1884, at 9:08 in the evening, an earthquake broke on the Ventas de Zafaraya fault, southwest of the city. Estimates place it between magnitude 6.5 and 6.7. Maximum intensity reached the 9th or 10th level, where solid masonry is destroyed rather than damaged. In the village of Arenas del Rey, roughly 9 out of every 10 houses collapsed. The church went down. Every public building went down. Around 1,200 people died across 100 municipalities in Granada and Malaga. More than 4,000 buildings were destroyed. And then it snowed on the survivors, and people kept dying for a week in the cold and the rubble. That is the same tectonic system currently producing tremors under Alhendín. Not the same fault, but the same basin, the same plate boundary, the same physics. It is the most serious seismic disaster in modern Spanish history, and it happened 140 years ago, which in geological terms is not. But 1884 is not a forecast, and it is important to say why. Nothing in the current data implies a repeat. The IGN has stated directly that no method exists to predict when, where, or at what magnitude the next earthquake will occur, and pointing at 1884 as though it were a countdown is capability, not schedule. It proves the region can produce that scale of event. It says nothing about there's a far more useful precedent, and it is much more recent. Went through the largest seismic crisis in its modern history. The IGN recorded more than 3,000 earthquakes centered on the Atarfe and Santa Fe sector. 5 separate events reached magnitudes between 4.1 and 4.4. In one stretch of late January 2021, a 4.4 was followed 3 days. Later by a 4.2, a 4.4, and a 4.1 in rapid succession, then another 4.4 days later. Residents slept in cars. The Prime Minister appealed publicly for calm. 7 months on, the sequence produced a 4.5 and wound down. That is the closest analog for what Granada is living through now, and it carries 2 lessons, pulling in opposite directions. The first is duration. That swarm ran for roughly 8 months. If the sequence follows anything like the same pattern, Granada is not days from the end of this. It could be weeks or months of intermittent shaking, quieting down and flaring back up without warning. The second is proportion. 3,000 earthquakes, and the Vega came through with damaged buildings, frightened people, and no fatalities. That swarm is the strongest available evidence that a sequence like this can run its full course and end without catastrophe. But there's a detail in the archives that has caught the attention of a seismologist at the University of Granada, and it involves a date much further back than 2021. The year is 1979, and the place names in the IGN catalog from that summer are eerie to read now. On the 20th of June, a magnitude 4.5 earthquake struck northwest of Betic de Granada. On the dot that COS, 30th of July, the ground west of Alhendín moved with a magnitude of 3.7. 1 day later, a 3.9 was recorded north of Gojar. Alhendín, Gojar. The same 2 municipalities that have anchored this week's sequence appeared together in a Granada earthquake series 47 years ago. A seismologist at the University of Granada has pointed out that the 2026 episode presents similarities with the 1979 one, while adding that it is still too early to determine whether this is a new swarm with comparable characteristics. That is the correct level of caution, and it is worth noticing how consistently Spanish scientists have held that line all week. Not one has offered a forecast. Everyone has offered a framework. So where does that leave the picture right now? Confidence is high on what has already happened. The sequence is real, shallow, concentrated along the southern margin of the Granada Basin, and it has produced 2 events at magnitude 4.8 in 4 days, plus hundreds of smaller ones. The count has run past 493 and keeps climbing. Overnight into Wednesday, at least 10 more earthquakes were recorded. The largest, a 3.4 beneath Ogijares, followed by 9 tremors between magnitude 1.5 and 2.5, and dozens of smaller ones beneath them. Confidence is moderate on what kind of sequence this is. The behavior looks like a swarm rather than is still needed to confirm it. Several nearby earthquakes are not on their own enough to declare a swarm. Confidence is low, close to zero, on what comes next, not because the science is weak, but because this question is one seismology cannot answer anywhere on Earth. Aftershocks may continue. Their intensity and timing cannot be known in advance. Further activity remains possible, and officials have said so directly, rather than promising an all clear they cannot deliver. That is what an honest forecast looks like when the honest answer is uncertainty. So what should anyone in the affected area actually do with that? The practical guidance emerging from Granada this week is unglamorous and specific, and worth repeating precisely because it is not dramatic. Stay out of visibly damaged buildings until they have been inspected. Do not use lifts while aftershocks continue, because a lift is the one place in a building where you can be trapped by a tremor too small to hurt anyone else. If shaking starts, running into a street lined with loose facades, photograph new cracks as they appear, because documenting what changed and when is what lets an engineer tell a fresh fracture from an old one. Request a technical inspection of shared building elements if facades, roofs, or stairwells show damage. And understand that in Spain, earthquake damage is generally handled through the Consorcio de Compensación de Seguros rather than directly by a private insurer, which is exactly the administrative detail nobody researches until the week they need it. There is one more layer to this story, and it is the one that makes the outcome so different from Spain has modern seismic building regulations. The NCSR standard governs earthquake-resistant construction, and Granada is formally classified as a high-hazard zone under Spanish code. The official hazard maps are built around a 475-year return period and a 10% probability of exceedance in 50 years. And they are why buildings, infrastructure, and emergency plans in Andalusia are designed the way they are. When Andalusia activated the emergency phase of its seismic risk plan within the hour on the 15th of August, that was not improvisation. That was a plan, written for exactly this, pulled off the shelf and executed. The result is visible in the numbers. 2 magnitude 4.8 earthquakes, hundreds of tremors, a metropolitan region, shaken for 5 straight days, and the human cost stands at 3 minor injuries and a set of anxiety cases. 6 apartment blocks evacuated rather than collapsed. The Alhambra closed for inspection rather than damaged. That gap between what happened and what could have happened is not luck. It is 140 years of engineering standards written in the aftermath of a disaster nobody wants to repeat. Which is, in the end, the most important thing to take from this week. Granada is not experiencing something unprecedented. It is experiencing something characteristic. This basin shook in 1431, in 1884, in 1979, in 2021, and now in 2026. And it will shake again because the African plate is still moving north, and the crust beneath Andalusia is still adjusting to it. What changes between those episodes is not the geology. It is how well prepared the people living on top of it are when the ground starts moving. Watch the IGN bulletins rather than social media speculation. Watch whether the magnitudes trend downward over the coming days, or hold steady, because that is the clearest signal available on where this sequence is heading. Watch the inspection results in Las Gabias and the surrounding towns. Do not expect a clean ending because swarms do not deliver one. They fade unevenly on their own. The ground under Granada has been moving for millions of years. This week, it simply moved where people could feel it.